And we're off. Okay. All right. So just go ahead and tell me your first and last name and what you do at First Institute.
Okay. Well, hello, my name is Eric Copeland. I am a composer and producer and educator, and I teach the 101 and 102 from the RASP department here at First Institute. I basically teach anyone coming in at any level how to learn how to listen critically to music, what the music business is all about, the jobs in music. I teach them Pro Tools, and I teach them Logic, which we're in right now. And then we also do a lot of different other things like music theory is the second thing I teach. 102 is all music theory, teaching people many times without any music background at all, how to read and understand music theory. And we also get into sound design and all sorts of other things, kind of the beginning two classes for any student coming into the RASP, the Recording Arts and Show Production Department of First Institute.
Wonderful. So when you heard the news that Burt Bacharach had passed away, what was your initial reaction to that?
Somebody asked me if I knew the name Burt Bacharach, and I was like, yeah, it's kind of like knowing, do you know the name Paul McCartney? Because really, when you look at those two names, McCartney Lennon or Burt Bacharach, Carol Bayer Sager, and some of his partners in writing, I think Burt Bacharach kind of came on just a little bit before the Beatles and before Paul McCartney, but just as influential. If you just look back at all the songs that he wrote through the 60s, it's like he was a little like the Pharrell or whoever you would consider the person writing all the hits behind all the pop artists today. He's a little like that. He was writing for Dionne Warwick. He was writing for all sorts of like pop hits from the 60s, from the 70s, especially from the 60s, but also the 70s, things that you know so well. Some things that are just absolutely like standards for anyone to go out and play a gig. They're going to be playing these songs. And a song that just meant so much to me because I recorded it before on my own, and I've recorded several times for other artists, which is Close to You, which is one of the greatest well-known songs. And of course, my dad was a big Carpenters fan, and so he knew the Carpenters, and they did some of Burt Bacharach's work. And that song, I've covered it myself and sung it at many events and things like that. And then you have, just all the pop hits that he did that are now so much part of our American musical vernacular, basically. And then on top of all that, we forget that he did the theme to Arthur, which is one of my favorite movies from back in the day. And that song, which was a great big huge hit, Arthur's theme, and then Christopher Cross was part of that and sang that. And that movie and that soundtrack is just it's amazing. And so when you just think of all the, plus he was in Austin Powers. So what are you going to say about Burt Bacharach? To the fact that he's just one of those iconic American songwriter. Really, he was more known as a songwriter than anything, which is really a cool thing. As a composer, mainly, I feel like I'm mostly a composer and songwriter. He's just one of those legends, similar to Paul McCartney, even though Paul McCartney's really more of a performer too, and was part of the Beatles. But I think Burt Bacharach really just provides something very unique in our culture, which is a songwriter who was so well known for, I'm sure he produced, I'm sure he did other things, but his songs were the backbone of this country in the 60s for sure, and into the 70s and 80s. So.
Oh, even now, a lot of people, like you mentioned, forget some of the songs. And I know probably with you teaching the way that you teach and the young minds that come through that door, I'm sure they're quite, just like, oh, he wrote that? Kind of surprised to know that this gentleman has been around for so long and he has created so many amazing hits.
I know when you look at all the things he's written, it's almost impossible to believe all of these songs came from one person. And when you're looking at the man who shot Liberty Valance, you could just look at anything on anywhere on this list, just the stuff he wrote for Dionne Warwick and all of her, many Carpenters things. He not only wrote They Long to Be Close to You, which is I've been talking about already, but Walk On By, which is like a standard from the 60s. There's always something there to remind me. Are you kidding? These hits just keep coming when you continue to look through. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's just basically our songbook from the 1960s and every other song. I remember my mother taught piano lessons, and every sheet music, it said the same thing up in the corner, written by Burt Bacharach and maybe Carol Bayer Sager or somebody like that, you know. And it's just the immensity of his songwriting is just unmatched, really, I think, in American music.
How did he inspire you in your throughout your musical career and now into your teaching?
Well, musically, as a composer and songwriter, it just has so much to do with his chords. He was he wrote a lot of jazzy and unique chords inside pop music. Where in a time, and in general, in the American songbook, where there's so much straight one chord and 1 4 5, this simplistic chord changes. His songs were anything but simplistic. They were using these unique kind of chords, these suspended chords and jazzy chords and stuff like that, that not everybody used. I mean, they were probably used more in the 60s and 70s than they are now, but still they weren't as used as he used them. The way to inflect, and of course, songs were very different. The top 40 was a very different place. Even after the Beatles, it was a very different place when than it is now, where we have similar types of music all the time versus really unique things that we had throughout the 60s and 70s, things you wouldn't imagine were #1 hits that are #1 hits. But I think for me, what he did was show me I grew up with that. My dad was not a Beatles fan. He was strange in the fact most of the country was in love with the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or whatever was happening in the 70s, 60s and 70s. But my dad was more of a crooner lover. He loved Vic Damone, who was one of the first gigs that Burt Bacharach had was as being a piano player for Vic Damone, who was a famous crooner singer back in the 50s and 60s. And so that was just all, that music was always on at my house growing up, whether I liked it or not. And the piano lessons were playing his songs, and Close to You was playing a million times by the Carpenters. And so it was just so much of the part of the formative years for me as a songwriter and as a musician, learning these chords. So absolutely very, very influential on me as both a composer and probably a producer as well.
What about going into your classes, you know, when you're teaching newer students about Burt and all of his music? I'm sure his name has come up quite a few times in your theory classes and a lot of other moments. Do you see like the engagement kind of go up a little bit when they realize who you're talking about?
If I approach it in a way they can relate to. For instance, if I compare him to someone like Pharrell, who is a well-known producer to them, but also they know him for being a songwriter, and then they can see him behind the scenes with so many other artists, and I can then equate him to somebody, to equate Burt Bacharach into the situation where I say, this is we've had these through the decades. We've had these people that are so influential. They not only influence the music of the day, but they influence all the artists to work with them. So we have so many of these things where we'll have this person and Drake and this person and Future and Coldplay, and they get together and they do these things, and they kind of, and that was even going on back in the 60s and in the 70s, where you had this influential songwriter writing for all these people. And you see that now, the influential producer, Timbaland or whoever it is, he's writing for whatever artist and this artist and that artist and this artist. And if people could tie those together, most people don't these days, but if they tied it together, they see featuring Pharrell, featuring Timbaland, featuring whoever, and they're like, wow, I didn't know that they were tied together. And so I can bring up people like Burt Bacharach and people like the Beatles and other songwriters of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And in that way, I bring them back. You know, it's harder for newer students to remember these names from long before they were born, especially the students I'm dealing with now. But back in the day when I was going to school and you know, some of the different colleges I went to, of course, you know, Burt Bacharach and he was still a thing at that time, you know, still actually making those songs, and part of those things like Arthur's Theme, which was this dates me a little bit, but Arthur's Theme came out the first year I went to college. So you know, that was a big #1 hit when I was originally in college way back in the day when I first started. So yeah, it's so influential. And even when that was happening, we couldn't believe one guy was pumping out all of these hits in the 70s, 80s. We were just like, how is his name on everything?
Well, he worked with in 2005, he worked with Dr. Dre to
Wow,
produce a more jazz type ensemble album, which I thought was incredible. Just because,
not surprised.
right, right. Well, the fact that he was able to kind of, music is always changing. Um, the sound is always changing. And what makes you great is when you can change with it all
Yeah,
and just be a chameleon
yeah,
in music.
absolutely. And that's the key to a long career in music. You have to be able to continue to work with everyone. You cannot just sit in your room in your box and just work. You have to be available and work with all sorts of people. I'm a big proponent of hiring the right person for the right job, session players and producers and engineers and all these people, and then collaborating with other great artists. And that's what he did through his entire career. And he was, I think we've forgotten a little bit of that. Everybody is on their own these days in their little home studios and doing their things, but uh, that's not the way great music is usually made. It's usually made by great musicians and great musical minds getting together. And he did that with so many great minds, from artists to other songwriters to producers and bands, all that kind of stuff. So it's
So
amazing.
coming from the music world, what kind of loss do you feel like the music community is going through right now?
When this happens, I usually look back rather than forward. In other words, I don't look forward and go, "Oh, we're not going to hear any more songs from Burt Bacharach anymore." But at the same time, he had probably got to that point. There's another person who's 90 years old right now who we're still hanging on to, and that's John Williams, who is as influential as Burt Bacharach probably as a composer, and he's still working on Indiana Jones 5 or 6 or whatever it is. He's working on the newest stuff. And so we still have that kind of thing going. But I tend to look back, like when some of my musical heroes die, and I think, wow, what a great catalog they left us with, so that we can relive and redo over and over. We can make new arrangements and new recordings of these songs and investigate them in different ways. And I would imagine that's going to come out here, new recordings of Burt Bacharach songs and things like that. And so that's what I tend to do when someone passes, is concentrate on, wow, we had him for so long and we have all lived this great material. And I only could hope that I would leave some kind of legacy like that when I pass, so that there's at least a mark that I was here, and there is a great big mark that he was here, and we have those songs to celebrate forever. They're not going anywhere. And so that's what I tend to do when this kind of thing happens.
Well, that's a wonderful thing about music. It never dies.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's around forever.
absolutely. Whenever you think about, the future, like you said, his legacy obviously is going to continue over the next, however many years we have or whatever. But how do you feel? Do you believe that his music will continue to shape the way music is made and composed and listened to in the future?
You know, we've had artists before and composers before, like Bach, for example, who was big in his day and very prolific, and then his music kind of disappeared after his death for a long time until it was revived. And I think people continue to like revive composers from decade to decade or whatever, and we go back and we get into a time where right now it's the 80s. The 80s are huge, and everybody's redoing everything in the 80s. But I think there will always be times when people go back. I know I have go back to his songs and say, let's freshen this up for today's audience and make it good for this kind of thing. And there's so much there. And so, yeah, I think that there is lots of chance for us to take that and revisit these songs, just like we do Irving Berlin's songs, or we do anybody's songs that was one of the great composers of our country, or just in general in the world, Mozart or whoever it is. We're constantly reinventing their music and bringing it back, and a new audience is finding it. So I think there's no doubt that this will happen with Burt Bacharach as well.
Yeah, sampling of music is definitely something you notice more and more, especially when you hear songs from your era. And
Uh,
then you're like, wait a minute, I thought that was, you know, this song, and it turns out it's a brand new song somebody else did, and these kids they
Yeah,
think it's brand new, and I'm like, no, I've gotten
yeah.
to that age.
Oh,
All great things come back around. Well, is there anything else that you would like to add that I may have left out?
it's just like you said before, and there's not many people who pass and I go, wow, they were so influential on me. As yeah, a few years ago, Al Jarreau passed away, who was a big, I was a big fan of his work. And it was so very influential on me as a producer and as a songwriter. And I just loved him. You know, he was just like we all have those like top 5 desert island artists, you know, where you have to have their whole catalog with us if we were stuck somewhere. And he was one. But Burt Bacharach, from a songwriting point of view, when I listen back to some of his songs where I just sing them in my head, I'm thinking about all these chords and that I've been using forever in my songwriting and in my producing, where they're not used a lot these days, you know. And they were just special and they were unique, and it took a mind that, and he was positioned perfectly in time to do what he did. And I remember not just me, but my father, who was also a professional musician, and just my uncle and so many other people who were professionals in music that were affected by songwriters. But certainly in that time, Burt Bacharach was the king songwriter. There's really no comparison. You can't even compare McCartney to him. I guess that would be the closest thing in his time, in that time. And even though he came a little bit before Paul McCartney, but still, I think he stands very uniquely alone in his songwriting prowess in that time. Just one of the greats of songwriting for sure. So.
Do you you know how they say, oh, this new composer or artist is very reminiscent of Tom Jones or something like that? Do you feel that will ever be the case with Burt?
You mean that there will be someone else like him?
Yes.
I feel like there are a lot of people like him. They find the ear of the day, and I think I've mentioned Pharrell. I think he's found an ear of the time. Timbaland also. I mean, there are producers like that come along, but they're more producers than they are songwriters. I feel like they're produced songwriter, they're writing and producing. And I'm not sure. I don't know the history of how much he produced, but I'm pretty sure that he was mainly the songwriter influence and not the production company or anything like that. It was a little bit different back in that day because of the way music was produced. It wasn't quite produced by everybody's hands like it is now, you know, on their laptops or whatever. So you really had to go in and do it old-fashioned way with players and studios and all that kind of stuff back then. So there wasn't a way to just like whip it out on your computer at home. It was the 60s and 70s. We didn't have those. And so you had to actually go in the studio with great musicians, great artists, and track these songs. And then they became true #1 hits, and they're still played on oldie stations and redone by jazz groups and everything. They're timeless pieces, and you can just read through the names and be like, oh, I can't believe he did that one. Like just like you said earlier, I can't believe he did that. Oh, he did that one too. Oh, he did that song. And so because we know them from so many different artists, and then there were remakes of them by rock groups and stuff like that, and we just keep going and forward. And then they played in an Austin Powers movie, and then there he is on the bus in the Austin Powers movie, playing the piano. And so he's just part of our culture and part of our, especially anything from the 60s and 70s that you're listening to so much. There was such a great chance that he wrote it in pop music. So it's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely.